The United States Space Force is building a warfighting culture in a domain that behaves very differently from air, land, sea, or cyberspace. Readiness in space isn't always visible. It's measured in resilience, decision advantage, and the ability to maintain mission assurance in an environment where actions may be difficult to detect and even harder to attribute. That means moving beyond access and presence in orbit towards resilience, integration, and the ability to operate through disruption. It also means rethinking how intelligence, cyber capabilities, and space operations come together to support the joint force. Few leaders have operated across those boundaries as directly as Lieutenant General Greg Gagnon. With a career spanning intelligence, cyber operations, and now senior leadership within the Space Force, he brings a perspective shaped by multiple domains and a clear understanding of how they intersect in modern conflict. Today's conversation explores what readiness looks like in space, how the threat environment is evolving, and what it takes to build and lead forces prepared to operate in a contested domain. I'm Bill Woolf, and this is Spacepower. Lieutenant General Gagnon, you spent much of your career in intelligence and cyber before moving into senior space leadership roles. How has that background shaped how you think about space as a warfighting domain?
Thanks for doing the podcast today. I think it's very important for people to understand the missions of the Space Force for the nation, and more specifically, what we do in Combat Forces Command. My background is one of being a military officer for 32 years. And like many officers in the Space Force, particularly at the senior level, I started that journey in the Air Force. I was blessed enough to start as an intel officer, and the blessing of being the intel officer, Bill, is you're involved in operations from day one. And 30 years ago, 25 years ago, 20 years ago, our nation was highly engaged all over the world. So I had the opportunity to kind of participate in my craft and in my profession in our game, right? Like our game is conducting military operations around the world, and nothing gives you better feedback than actual combat. So understanding that military forces plan, they execute, and then they assess is pretty much the three things that military forces do, regardless of service or regardless of domain. So just understanding best practices in that, and how to be combat effective and not effective for just the easy adversary, but combat effective for any adversary. Those are the type of things you learn over the years. I was blessed to be in the Air Force, where we had a large amount of resources to do what we do. But the Air Force that I joined was an Air Force that was a senior citizen. They've been around since 1947. They had taken some tough hits, and they have learned from those tough hits. The Air Force I was in had a warfare center in Nevada, right, where they learned that if they trained people early enough before they got to combat in a realistic combat environment, that those people would be more successful. Those type of institutional resources that existed in my service before don't exist in my service today. So those are the kind of things that myself and my peer group at the kind of the senior board of directors level and the Space Force talk about. How do we build that combat experience? How do we get the resources to do that? Because when the nation needs us, we need to win.
Thank you, General. You talked about the Warfare Center at Nellis. I was honored to be stationed at Nellis Air Force Base at the Warfare Center for a period in our history when space wasn't included in red flag type exercises.
Yeah.
So as the commander responsible for combat ready space forces, what does readiness look like in space today, and how does it differ from other domains?
Yeah. I would tell you, readiness looks like what I saw Friday night. So I think today's Wednesday. My days kind of bleed together in this job. But Friday night, I drove up to Buckley with my senior enlisted leader, and we did a no notice on the cruise. And we watched them executing combat operations in support of Operation Epic Fury. They were motivated, they were trained, and they were executing with extreme proficiency. I talked to 2 Canadian members, military members who were on the crew, and just as proficient, just as trained, actually same training as our guys. I then talked to the lieutenant. There were 2 of them that were mission commanding that night. And one of those lieutenants started his operational duties at the beginning of the war. He finished training. And I said, whoa, you're telling me your first night on rack, you're engaged in combat? He goes, yes, sir, I was ready. And I said, has there been anything? He says, there's a couple things I've had to do better, but no, everything's been fine. So, Wolfie, when I say, what does readiness look like? It looks like when your second lieutenant is executing crew operations in support of missile warning for Operation Enduring Freedom, having just come out of his MQT and been certified. And he's actually got a level of confidence that isn't hubris, but is demonstrating. And I saw that. It was Lieutenant Parr. Now, this kid, he's not a regular kid. He went to Michigan, okay? So, Aero, that's the kind of folks we have in the service. My biggest concern, now that we're in April, is his focus. Because I know Michigan is, still in the tournament and is in the Final Four. So I just have to make sure that I deconstruct his crew time with game time, and we're ready to go.
Sir, it's an important point you bring up is when crews are getting certified and they're ready to accomplish their operational mission, they're ready to go. The question is, and General Saltzman's talked about this in the past, is do we have the tools? Do you have the tools necessary to do advanced training, whatever that advanced training looks like, to ensure that those crews are prepared, not just initial qualification training, but then your recurring monthly training and your advanced training, similar to what we were talking about with the red flag exercise. And the reason why red flag was so important, as you alluded to, is because it got folks ready to fight in combat before they got to combat. And most folks would say, hey, when I went to red flag, I got probably the highest level of training I'd ever gotten. And our wartime mission afterwards was relatively boring.
Yep.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about how you guys are tackling that.
Yeah. Let me pick that apart from 2 ways. One, you need to have the capacity of crew members in order to generate significant training events, because they can't be sitting mission and working in exercise at the same time. So the Space Force needs to grow. The Space Force we have is not the Space Force we need. The Space Force we have that has delivered space advantage and space control in Operation Epic Fury, in the Maduro raid, is not the Space Force we need in order to seize space control against the PLA, because that is a much different adversary. So in what we plan to train against, we plan to train against the hardest, most capable adversary. That requires trainers, simulators, and emulators. Over the last 2 years, General Saltzman has put significant money into operational test and training infrastructure called OTTI. That infrastructure has been built in a virtual and synthetic environment to allow different trainers to plug in. Now where we are in the Space Force is 40% of my units don't have trainers. They need those trainers to plug into that environment so that we can execute large force employment exercises that are representative of sort of that larger force packaging we would need to do to seize space control, because that is the purpose of the Space Force. The Space Force must be able to deliver the advantage of the high ground for the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Army, as well as our coalition partners. We aren't there yet. We have a clear vision of where we need to go. We have a plan on where we need to go. We don't have all the money in our wallet that we need to get there. And that's something we're working on. Let me flip this a little bit differently. You also need to deploy forward. We're seeing that in Operation Epic Fury with Space Forces deployed around the globe. Last summer, we practiced in the Indo-PACOM region. We had about 700 Guardians either operating from home station or flew forward into the Indo-PACOM region during resolute space. And you need to know how to get into theater. You need to know how to get your gear onto a C-17. You need to know how to get your gear off a C-17 and set up your site. You then need to know how to execute from your site. Those type of exercises take 700 extra people. If you only have enough people in your force to do your mission every day, you don't have enough people to prepare for tomorrow. That has been a fundamental challenge in America's smallest service. And it's a challenge we have to solve. The PLA is 3 times larger. Their Space Force is 3 times larger than the US Space Force. We need the capacity. So not only when we have the environment and we have the trainers, we have the people who can work that issue. Okay. And not only the people who are on crew in the exercise. You know this. Running one of these large force exercises, there's a whole plethora of people around that making that happen who used to do operations and understand the environment they need to create. And then there's a third group of people, everyone's favorite, the assessors who are sitting back there with the clipboards of old, right? That's now an iPad, right? Saying, all right, they did this. They didn't think about this. Because then all that coming back at the end is the debrief, the vicious debrief that tells you what you did right, what you could have done better, and what you pretty much just jacked up, right? And through that process, in a simulated environment or a constructed environment or a virtual environment, you will generate space forces that are better. Better not to just prepare for war, but prepare to win.
Yes, sir. And you're talking a little bit about and I might have the terminology wrong. It might have been updated since the last time I checked on it, but the Ready Space Crew program.
Yes.
Where you've got the combat to dwell cycle. So for other domains, they do have a place where they train to get ready for their combat cycle, and then they're ready to support operations. So can you talk a little bit about the Ready Space Crew program and how that's working today?
So Ready Space Guardian program, I just jacked it up, but Ready Space program is basically how we've decided how many crews it takes to do mission, to run 24/7 mission. And then how many crews that we retain off that mission cycle. The mission cycle's 5. How many we retain off that? It's usually 3 that we use to prepare and train in order to enter combat cycle again. That process is our process for how we man crews within our operational units. And Bill, you and I are a prisoner of our experience. We grew up in the Air Force, so we took the Air Crew Ready program and we made it the Space Force Ready Crew program, okay? In other services, there's other ways they do this. If you're in the Navy and you have a strategic nuclear submarine, ballistic missile submarine, you may have blue and gold crews. Totally different units that go out, one executes, the other one's home station, and they flip it so that they can get more time using the weapon system. That's another concept we need to think about. I will tell you, in a war where there's losses, okay, you need to have strategic reserves. They can't simply be your crew not on mission, okay? So you need to think about force structure in a way in a war that an adversary has long-range fires that can deliver effects like we're seeing in CENTCOM today, but think PLA, much greater scale, right? You need to have strategic forces that can reconstitute the operational force. So the Ready Space Crew program is important. Step 1.
No, thank you, General. I appreciate that. And again, it's been a long time since we examined that because I remember back in the day we started looking at this because you're right. You've got to quantify the capability you need and the expertise you need based on the emerging threat. So let's talk about that for a moment. With your intelligence background, how important is intelligence integration to successful space operations? And how is that integration evolving as threats become much more sophisticated?
Yeah. So I will tell you the Space Force has made significant advances in the intelligence discipline inside the service, quite dramatically in the last 6 years. Where we're moving now is from not just warning and informing of adversary action, because we have a global network of sensors now that are the best in the world that help us understand what's happening in the space domain, but also what adversary space forces are thinking about doing in the future. But that warning and informing is step 1. That's sort of the strategic to the operational level. We also have intelligence forces embedded in those crews so that during execution, there is real-time intelligence to feed current operations that are executing. one thing I've been working on with Space Systems Command, and they've been making great progress on this, is decreasing the amount of time from observation to decision. Because some of our sensors have latency times associated with the delivery of the information and turning it into intelligence. So that speed of processing, of tasking, processing, exploiting, and disseminating that information to the decision maker for them to make the right decision with the right information, that timeline is shrinking. That's a second part of it for operational execution. The third piece of it, and it's where we're nascent today, is understanding that in combat operations, you will generate force, you will apply force, but then you will have to decide on a restrike recommendation. You will need to do combat assessment. You will need battle damage indicators collected. Tracing all of that for a combat cycle is what we're thinking about today. And how do we train that into the force? Because the Space Force we have is not the Space Force we need. The Space Force we have has got 5 to 6 years of protect and defend experience, protecting and defending space assets. The Space Force we need is the Space Force that can protect, defend, and as a critical part of the joint force, attack. Because the adversary in our pacing challenge has an on-orbit layer that is second only to ours. There are only 2 countries in the world that can track mobile targets at great distance, okay? The United States and the CCP. We don't want to provide them that advantage in war. We must take that away, because what you can track when you have long-range fires, you can kill. And we need to protect our sailors, our soldiers, our guardians forward, our Marines, and all parts of the coalition and joint force. That's our sacred bond as part of a military service.
Sir, as you talk about the threats, and you did say that a lot has evolved in the Space Force over the last 6 years, can you talk a little bit about not the specific threats, because we understand the classified nature of those potential threats, but how do you go out and comb the environment to determine how the threats are evolving? And so is there a process by which you're saying, yes, we need to go and examine what those future threats are, what today's threats are, and then what the potential future threats are, and ensure your forces are ready for those future threats?
Yeah, we do that. We do that day in and day out. We actually have a Delta specifically designed to do intelligence. And that Delta that's in Combat Forces Command focuses on collection of real-time information and feeding that into operations. We also have an organization out in Dayton called the National Space Intelligence Center, which is a national IC agency, which is the Guardian's National Intelligence Community Agency. They look at forecasting longer term intelligence to understand where our adversaries' weapon systems are going, where their doctrine's going, and where their strategies are going. So the unit that's inside Combat Forces Command is about force application. It's about application of space power every day in real-time intel, and the other one is more long-term. And they are executing their missions every day as a sub-element of the Space Force's senior intel officer, who is the 18th member of the National IC. So they do that job every day. Even at an unclassed level, I can tell you this. When President Xi came to power, the CCP had 87 satellites in outer space. Today, they have over 1,300. And we talk about the numbers of intercontinental ballistic missiles they have, the size of their Navy. We talk about the number of aircraft. What's really important is how they plan to put it all together. And they plan to put it all together in a way that power projects like no other country other than the United States. And to be clear, our allies can power project generally only as a partner of us. It is a uniquely American thing to be able to think about sustaining combat power on the other side of the planet. But that is, in fact, where the PLA is headed.
Sir, I try to quote you occasionally based on the interview that you did with SFA a couple of years ago when you're sitting in the S2 shop at the Space Force headquarters. And what you talk about is the difference from other countries and their approach to space capabilities and space dominance. And you talk about how a communist country is much different than a capitalistic society, and how a majority of our satellites are commercially based satellites.
Yeah.
But every satellite in our potential adversary countries are basically for national security purposes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would tell you out of that 1,300 number, um, you have to start with the concept and the idea that you're in an authoritarian state. Okay, you're in an authoritarian state, and some of those satellites are completely military, national security owned. Some of them are owned by their state. They're called SOEs. They have like two major defense primes that do space. One's CAS and the other one's KASIC. And then others are what they are trying to start now, which is their venture capitalist private firms. Um, they've been trying to develop that because they can't keep up with the American private sector, to be quite frank, and they see that as a place of innovation. But the pace in which the PLA and the CCP have moved in outer space is fundamentally because of President Xi's vision for space, and also the centralized control of funds that they use to pay for state funded things, whether that's directly military or through the state owned enterprise. That's what SOE means. But just think about that. Half of Lockheed Martin would be owned by the government, or 90% of it. So they're doing that stuff on behalf of the state. Um, in that 1,300 number today, okay, over 500 of them are remote sensing satellites that can be used for them to kind of build their kill chain in the Western Pacific. The other thing I would highlight is the advances in launch that I expect to see coming soon. So America has been the beneficiary of the extreme innovation of SpaceX, right? Reusable rockets, the fact that when you bring the rocket back, you can save money, you can decrease launch costs. That, coupled with the revolution in microchip miniaturization, right, has made satellites smaller. So now you can get more satellites into space at a lower cost, right? That has been an inherently American awesome characteristic, right? That's about to change. The Chinese are about to bring reusable launch in the next 2 years, be my guess. I'm watching them practice it now, because I continue to consume information about what's going on in space, not just from an American perspective, but from a global perspective. That will change their ability to put even more stuff in outer space. The separation on the US side is pretty profound. Like, we believe in a private sector. That's actually one of our ideals. It's not the ideal in a communist country. And you're not mirroring. You're not looking at yourself in the mirror. And a lot of people make that mistake when they think about it.
Yes, sir. You talk about innovation in launch. A lot of companies out there are doing exactly that. And I think what you're saying is the private sector, the commercial sector, is a force multiplier for the Space Force. And we've heard it from other Space Force leaders is you're not going to do this on your own. You're going to rely heavily on the commercial sector to help define the capabilities, build the capabilities. And I know you're looking across a wide swath of capabilities that are currently in development.
Yep. We are. My role in this is not really the tech sensing. That's more Phil Garant's lane in Space
Mhm.
Systems Command down in Los Angeles. My job is to articulate what it is that we need in order to deliver space superiority when asked. The ability to protect and defend U.S. capabilities, and the ability as part of the joint force to attack adversary space capabilities so that they can't use them. I must articulate what my needs are. Phil runs a large organization that's been around. We also have multiple other acquisition organizations that do tech sensing pretty consistently, and we don't always have the right idea, and we need to recognize that. What our job is to best articulate that in which we need to achieve, right? So that we can unlock really creative people on the outside to tell us how they can meet that need. Um, we need to not to be overly prescriptive, because that kind of inhibits their ability to think and to innovate. And we just need to be mindful of that. But we have to do all that while we need to be running on a track really fast, because the PLA is running really fast.
Yes, sir. And with the way you describe it, and for folks who don't know the intersection between Space Systems Command,
Yeah.
STARCOM, and Combat Forces Command, can you talk a little bit about how you're probably the most demanding customer in the entire process of saying, these are the capabilities we need to accomplish the mission? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So what happens like writ large, if you think about the Space Force as in particularly the Space Forces that I call the institutional forces, the forces or the commands, if you will, that are the bedrock of the service, not the forces we provide to the Joint Force. There's three major organizations. There's the one that gets the young lady from high school, puts her in basic, gives her initial skills training. That's STARCOM. Then there's the organization that has most of our money, okay, has our requirements and does all the buying of everything we need. That's Space Systems Command. Then there's the command that takes those pieces of equipment and those young guardians and turns them into combat capability by putting them together, putting them in a unit, putting them on crews, executing the generation of those crews and presenting them to other generals in the Space Force who employ them for execution of military operations. That's the general kind of process model of the service. Um, each of us has to do our job well, but we also have to do our job together so that we clearly communicate for positive end states. The Space Force has not seen major increases in budget over the last 4 or 5 years. It's been marginal. So Phil's ability to deliver more stuff to us has been a little limited in that light. We've also not seen large plus ups in manpower so that we could generate more crews to put on more weapon systems. That has been an inhibiting factor. I'm hoping that gets solved moving forward.
Yes, sir. We here at the Space Force Association are advocating heavily to grow the size of the end strength for the Space Force. And so we've heard testimony both from Chief Pennsylvania and General Bratton recently to talk about those specific initiatives.
Can
You've
I share something with you? So,
Yeah, of
like,
course.
I say that sometimes to folks on the Hill, and they say, well, why can't you just use the people you have? And then I usually go back with this. Do you want me to provide less missile warning to our fielded forces and the National Command Authority? Because that takes people who are purposely trained to deliver missile warning. Do you want me to use the people who are running our reconnaissance operations at geostationary orbit, like using our GSAT weapon system? No, 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 we don't. We need to know what's going on out there. Yeah, we absolutely do. Do you want me to take the crews that are providing the GPS signal to the world? No, 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 I don't. I was like, okay, there's no extra folks. Okay, just a little bit about the Space Force. I'm in Combat Forces Command that used to be called Space Operations Command, SPOC. SPOC was over 1,300 people in the headquarters. I'm 831. So that has all come down. And what we've done is we take those folks and we've put them into mission because as much as people on the Hill don't want me to stop doing those global operations, neither do the combatant commanders. The only thing that's been consistent is that they want more space. And in order to do that, we can look for efficiencies and stuff, but we need to be mindful of the fact that the new mission of gaining and maintaining space superiority is the growth mission because the PLA has decided, because the CCP has decided that they will extend war to space if they go to war. They have made that decision. They have fielded forces. They have equipped forces. They have trained forces. It is very clear that if that war starts, that war will extend to space. It is also very clear that we must not cede the high ground to others, because if we do, we will lose the ability to provide missile warning. We will lose the ability to provide assured communications for the National Command Authority. We will lose the ability to see further and sense better and more deeply. And in that, we will lose the ability of precision and survivability. And we should never, ever accept that as the plan because that's absurd.
And sir, I think it's important to note that you're not just presenting forces to U.S. Space Command. A majority of forces go there, but every combatant command around the globe has a need to gain and maintain space superiority. So, can you talk a little bit about your coordination and communication with the other Space Force service components around the globe?
Yes. So for Indo-PACOM, General De Niro is the commander of space forces for Indo-PACOM. My job is to provide him forces that he can employ in support of the Indo-PACOM plans and operations. There's a similar general, much taller, and he's in Europe, and that's General Middleton. Okay, he's like 6'4", maybe 6'5". And then there's the general who calls me at all times of the night, and that's General Benson, and he's from Tampa because he's executing Operational Epic Fury. And my job and my command relationship with them is to support them, to answer their requests for forces once the Pentagon has decided it's valid, and send those forces forward. Since February 28th, my headquarters has been executing the sustainment function in order to sustain forces forward in support of Epic Fury. Before that, we were sustaining forces and deploying forces in support of Southcom operations. So we've been very busy in the support role. And for those commanding generals, their job is not to train. Their job is not to equip. Okay. Their job is to employ. So they take my units or CFC's units and General Saltzman's units, and they use them in their daily execution of operations. And those combat operations execute for a period of time. Then I recover those forces and I recover that equipment. And I do the very unsexy stuff of letting them have time out and relax with their family, fixing equipment, and then retraining them to do it again. And we do that for all combatant commands. The majority of what I provide goes to General Blythewood out at Space for Space, which supports General Whiting's UCP mission of delivering, the advantage of the high ground. But integration of space into all domains, that's being executed by those other generals.
Thank you, sir. From your perspective, what are the most significant challenges or threats facing U.S. and allied space forces right now?
The first challenge is mindset. The second challenge is capacity. For mindset, you watched the amazing operational proficiency of U.S. forces in Venezuela, an operation no other military in the world could execute. Very complex. Multi-domains came together. You've watched us in the first, 34 days maybe of this operation in CENTCOM execute with significant proficiency. We have executed these military activities against adversaries without space forces that are their own organization, that are, limited in part of their Air Force or whatnot. My main challenge is that people think it would be that easy against a country that has a large space force with sustained equipment. As I said earlier, the PLA is much larger in manpower than we are. They have been consistently resourced since their inception in December of 2015. So they actually predate the Space Force with their Space Force. And I don't want people to take the wrong lesson out of the most recent military activities. So that's the mindset problem.
Understand, sir. And in
Second,
talking to,
the
go ahead, sir.
second problem is capacity.
Yep.
Right. The amount of space forces needed to generate to support military operations in CENTCOM is much smaller than the capacity needed to support operations if we were directed to have action against the PLA or Russia.
Thank you for that, sir. I was talking to Colonel Alford down at Space Forces South recently,
Okay.
and he was talking about the need to set up infrastructure. And because we don't have a space operations center, and we're still working on, and from what I understand, a space ops directive that starts to quantify what each combatant command needs in terms of capability and capacity and authority necessary for that combatant commander to do those operations. So, using that example, you talked about Venezuela, using that example, and again, multi-domain is the way we're going to attack everything. There's not going to be a service that goes this alone in the US. It's always going to be multi-domain. How important is it to have dedicated space ops directive, the evaluation of a future space operations center in the AORs? From your perspective, what could that look like?
Uh, it is absolutely the build path we are on, but we're not getting after it fast enough because of resourcing constraints.
Yeah.
Uh, I went down to visit Alfred down in Tucson, and I went out to dinner with the guys. Actually, it was all guys that came from my organizations that were his headquarters because he didn't have one, right? He needed it. So he requested for forces, and those requests for forces got to me. So I sent them down. I got down there about 3 days before they were all about to rotate back, and they were pretty excited about what they had achieved. But the second piece, the first piece of this is yes, they need standing headquarters in each of those combat commands. Every other service has that. We need to have that. We're not there yet because of our resourcing constraints. But it's not just about faces. It's also about when you have them working for that commander of Space Forces, they start to learn their peer groups in the other components. They start to get very intimately involved in the planning with the COCOM, and they become better guardians and better joint warfighters that way. And the force gains. We need to be in that position. Let me give you another thing about institutional structure. When I got to go somewhere, I get on an Air Force airplane and we go somewhere, and I end up at a base that's like an Air Force base or an Army base, right? Like there's Ramstein. The reason we have global reach as Americans is because the United States Air Force has these long, enduring access and bases around the world. Space Force needs to grow that as well. We inherited some bases and access, but we haven't really thought deeply about how to grow them. That's part of the task to my headquarters. Space equipment must be in place prior to the war. It's hard to get lift during a war because we're moving other resources. So it must be there ahead of time. So we're working that in the headquarters now with a level of diligence that isn't a group of people we generally have. This is about international affairs stuff. This is about engagements with host nations. So this is the extra work of making sure that the Space Force we need is the Space Force we can deliver. And that's a lot of like unsexy warfighting stuff, but it's very important to being successful. And we're working on that.
Yes, sir. Yeah, your point's valid. And how can you have those types of international relations when you barely have enough resources to cover down on the missions you're currently executing? So,
So
eh,
it takes vicious prioritization, and that's what we're doing. We're continuing to be successful. I wouldn't want people to get the idea that we're not. Um, but there's more we need to do, and there's more we need to do so that we're a better teammate for the other services. 51% of my forces execute on other people's installations. Okay. I have 49 locations around the world, a little over 49. And of the over 160 squadrons we have in CFC, a third of them are Air Force. People don't know that. So a big part of our end strength is actually airmen that help sustain us.
yes, sir. Speaking of that, leading thousands of guardians and airmen, how do you build a culture that balances innovation, discipline, and operational urgency?
Yeah. Uh, I will tell you the culture I seek is one that is mindful of where I came from. I'm a prisoner of my own experience. I had 27 years in the Air Force, right? Like I know that. So I seek, a little bit of the core values that I had because I see them as incredibly valuable in whatever formation I've been in. And I've been in special operations formations. I've sailed with the Navy. I've lots of time with the Air Force, and I used to make the joke that senior officers didn't like when I was a captain, that I thought I was in the Army Air Corps because I was spending all my time with the Army deployed. Uh, but there's things that I've discerned out of outstanding units, right? There's a culture of accountability. You're accountable for your mission first and your people. And when people always try to choose between the two, I say it's a false argument. They go together. You got to take care of mission and you got to take care of people. And you got to recognize the purpose of a military unit is the mission. It's not a jobs program. Okay. The second thing, and this is individual to either the airman or the guardian, you need to be a master at your craft. You need to be extremely tactically proficient. And in the Air Force, your tactical proficiency generally peaked as a senior captain. Because you had been in the unit, you're in your third unit, tactical unit, your proficiency is tight. In the enlisted corps, that was technical sergeant. That's why it was called technical sergeant. And your job at that point was to train those junior to you, right? And then the major was the guy who was losing his hair, right? He was the old guy in the unit, right? But that's the second thing, tactical proficiency. The third thing that I see in effective units is the courage to correct, whether it happens in the debrief or it happens on the spot, right? The Air Force culture was to plan, brief, execute, debrief, right? That's what they taught us all growing up. The Marine Force culture is to viciously debrief right there. But have you ever seen a Marine who wasn't fit? No, right? That's important in elite units. And the final thing, and it's the hardest thing, it's to create the climate so that there's commitment to excellence. Above standard is the minimum, right? In my unit, because my unit is not an average unit. If you want to be in an average unit, go join another service. Like that has to be the bravado inside an organization if that organization wants to succeed. Because in combat, there's always at least two units. Okay? One's ours, one's theirs. You can't be second.
That reminds me of the wrestler that used to think about the competition around the world, across the globe, and he'd wake up in the middle of the night and he'd just start doing push-ups because he knew that they were doing push-ups at the same time that he was sleeping. So instead of sleeping, he'd get up and actually start doing exercises.
Oh, he's
So
falling behind.
one of the best wrestlers of all time. But really appreciate your time today, sir. Two-part question as we close this episode. Look into the future. One, what excites you most about where the Space Force is headed? And two, what do you think the public's most misunderstands about space power?
All right. Let me take the second one first.
Okay.
Space power is the formative purpose for your Space Force. It's to deliver space control, right? The ability to use the domain at the time and place of our choosing. And if necessary, take the advantages of the space domain away from an adversary. That's an inherently military function. What America starts to conflate is Space Force, NASA, NOAA, okay? If you're interested in space sciences, don't join the Space Force. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. If you're interested in space sciences, join NASA. If you're interested in space science and you want to, be the military force that makes sure that people can do space sciences, join a Space Force. And then there's NOAA and other organizations like that. And then you had a two-part question, but I forgot the second part. What was the other?
The second part, sir, was what excites you most about where the Space Force is headed?
What excites me the most is that we are making the pivot from purely protect and defend to protect, defend, and attack. And not just making a pivot, right? What excites me the most is the fact that I'm meeting people like Lieutenant Parr, right? Michigan grad. He could do anything he wanted to do in life, right? Like a smart kid. And this is his passion. His passion is to be part of a military service that defends the U.S. interests in space so that people can work at NASA, so people can work at SpaceX, so that our space industry can continue to be the most innovative in the world, because we're ensuring that those space lanes of communication stay open, just like the United States Navy makes sure that our sea lanes remain open, right? That's an important thing. And at the junior officer level and at the junior enlisted level, They get that. They feel that purpose. And if they know their why, sky's the limit. Sky's not.
Yeah, that's right. The sky is no longer the limit. I got this mug right here on my shelf that says "Aim higher."
Can I give you
Space Force.
something? So I picked this mug today on purpose. This is the Demon Chasers. This is the 91st. This was Hap Arnold's squadron in 1919. It was also the squadron that was in my cyberspace group when I was in the Air Force and I was a group commander. This was an offensive cyberspace unit. And it's about the continuing change that happens, but also understanding legacy, right? And drawing from it the important things.
Yes, sir. And yeah, we didn't hit on that too much, but the fact is you led at the cyber level too, the other invisible front line. So, and I've got a patch right here that's the Delta 6 patch. So you can talk about how critical cyberspace and cyberspace superiority is in this domain as well.
Yeah, I spent last night I worked out with Delta 6. So I was at Schriever. We're out on the field and we did a PT session. And at the end, they do this day in cyber history kind of thing. And I kind of shared with them, hey, how about this week in cyber history for the Space Force? Because the Space Force is continuing to deliver. And I tell stories about missile warning and GPS. But the fact of the matter is we don't do our job without cyberspace. Every space operation is a remote operation. It's either RF or it's binary ones and zeros. And they enable that to take place. The adversary seeks to eliminate our ability to stay connected to our kit. They're our front line doing that. And last night, they were sweating and breathing heavy, and I was trying to keep up. They're young.
Goes back.
They're young. I'm going to be honest.
Yes, sir. That next generation, it's going to be tough to keep up with them. They're smart and they're fit. And you're establishing that culture right there at CFC, which is phenomenal. General, as we close out, um, the whole world is watching as Artemis 2 launches back to the moon. And you talk about freedom of maneuver in the domain. So, how important is cislunar going to be to our future capabilities to ensure freedom of action in the domain for space exploration and science with NASA and what they're doing?
Yeah, there is no limit to outer space, right? As we move past geo and we extend back to the moon for other stuff, and as we expand cislunar or xgeo, if we're calling it that, there are a number of things we need to tackle as a nation. We need to continue to drive science out there so that we learn what we need to learn to help fuel innovation and use of space for humanity, and that remains important. It's also important to remember that in the American way of having, a lot of people, this is going to go a little different, but like a lot of foreigners, I talk to them a lot because I'm an intel officer. But people think they worry about hegemony, American being the dominant military or country in the world. But sometimes the story is, hey, because you were in charge, you set up a system in international trade and economics where there were a set of rules, and those rules were agreed to, and people followed them. We know that that's sort of the American way of executing things. So if America was the dominant power in space, it would continue to allow free access for science, commerce, and innovation in space. And I said, yep, that's true. And I said, let me tell you how the CCP would approach having dominance in any area. They'd probably treat it like the South China Sea. So 15 years ago on the South China Sea, there was this reef, and that's all there was. And the Chinese started dumping dirt on the reef. And the CCP said, don't worry, nothing to see here. And everyone believed them. And then they came and they paved that sand and they created an airstrip. And they said, don't worry, nothing to see here. Then on that airstrip, they put military equipment and they put military armaments on that island. And that's on the reef today. Now they claim that they have territorial rights in the South China Sea for gas and oil underneath the thing. And they're engaging with Filipino Navy and Coast Guard regularly about that area. So given the advantage of leverage, I think I know how the CCP acts, right? It's the same way they've been acting with Taiwan, where now they flow naval and air forces regularly in a 360 envelopment against the Taiwanese anytime that they have a flare-up. So the CCP shows us how they act with leverage. If they have leverage in any part of space, I don't think they'd act any differently. And it's important that we recognize that.
Perfect words from a prior intel officer, cyberspace professional, and now Space Force leader. General Gagnon, thanks so much for taking time on the Spacepower Podcast.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day.
Thanks, sir. You too. Thank you for joining my conversation with Lieutenant General Greg Gagnon. As always, it's so important that we have these conversations with leaders shaping the future of the space domain. If you found this discussion valuable, follow the show and share it with someone working in or around the space domain. You can also follow Space Force Association on social media to stay up to date on all things national defense space, and become a member of SFA at ussfa.org. We really appreciate you joining us today. Space Power is produced by Ty Holliday. I'm Bill Woolf, and we'll see you next time.